The title of this paper is inspired by an address that Barney gave at a conference in Olds, Alberta, celebrating 40 years of the Archaeological Society of Alberta. His presentation discussed the history of Alberta archaeology and what he saw as the future prospects for archaeology in this province. That talk is available on the Archaeological Society of Alberta's YouTube channel and is filled with interesting insights and tantalizing hints about various elements of the story of Alberta archaeology. Now, before I launch into the subject of our paper, Shawn and I want to highlight that resource, which hosts many different talks, especially those given as part of the Calgary Center's lecture series. And if you're watching it online right now, please give us a like. I also want to highlight another recently digitized source, this interview that Barney Reeves gave that has been preserved by the University of Lethbridge Library as part of the Waterton Lakes National Park Oral History Project. We at the U of L are actively seeking to preserve and present Alberta archaeology archival resources like these. So if you have any that you feel could be given accessible library-based archival treatment, please contact Shawn or I after the session. We also want to acknowledge Brian Vivian and Lifeways of Canada Limited, who are currently working through Barney's materials and sharing those with us. So here are a couple of fun pics that BV has shared with us that we thought you'd like. Looking at the massive excavation that we probably couldn't be allowed to do today. And then lying, I think, in the geological trench. So we'd like to thank Margaret and Allison for inviting us to speak in this session in honor of Barney. Our presentation stems out of one of those side projects that we are working on along with our renewed excavations at Head Smash and Buffalo Jump, a joint project we co-direct with Bob Daw, supported by the University of Lethbridge, the Head Smash and Interpretive Centre, and the Royal Alberta Museum, and funded by a SSHRC Insight grant. Part of our work is to tie together the past excavations of the site, which have not been connected with one another. Part of the problem is that the spatial relationships between excavation areas were well understood enough at the time that there wasn't a need to create a master map, nor was there a sense that the archaeological excavations themselves would be of historical interest in the future. Bob especially has been inviting previous excavators to visit the site to help us identify where exactly excavations took place. Barney's joined us shortly before his passing, and he laughed with us about how he had lost track of where he had excavated. But on the last day of digging at our last season, we did find the half axle that he had been using as one of his benchmarks. We were very happy about that. Now, Barney's passing and the wealth of knowledge that was lost about Head Smashed-In inspired Shawn and I to begin collecting stories about the history of excavations at Head Smashed-In that we intend to present as a monograph. As we have worked through various oral and written histories of the work at the site, we have come to realize how well the work conducted at Head Smashed-In over the years has led or mirrored other developments in Alberta archaeology. And what has been particularly interesting for us as we have worked through the history of the study of the site is how Alberta archaeology connects and deviates from larger themes in the development of North American and global archaeology in general. Barney played a particularly pivotal role in this development in terms of the volume of important excavations he participated in, his analysis of material culture in relation to cultural historical, but also, as we will argue, functionalist, structuralist conceptualizations, and in his network of connections with other archaeologists. Chronologically, he acted as a major pivot point between the generation of Richard McNeish and Dick Forbes and Barney's own and subsequent generation, especially reflected at the University of Calgary and through the consulting industry as BV has just described. We are trying, from a history of archaeology perspective, to contextualize Barney's theoretical approach, which, as Allison has already said, may be impossible, but we think the effort's worth it anyways. So Alberta archaeology has had an interesting relationship with broader trends in archaeological theory. McNeish's seeming hatred of anthropological theory seems to have been at odds with how Calgary became a center of theoretical innovation with the Jacmel conferences that were so unevenly influential. Likewise, there's a strong practical trend in Alberta archaeological work where the work drives theory and not the other way around. As we hope to demonstrate, there is an idiosyncratic richness to theoretical engagement by Alberta archaeology that is noteworthy and has made the work in the province so successful. Now, what we want to explore in the monograph we are writing is how the excavators of Head Smash and Buffalo Jump have been some of the drivers of the theoretical approaches to archaeology in the province. Excavations at Head Smash and Buffalo Jump have both embraced and defied the trends in archaeological theory in other parts of North America and the world. In this presentation, we want to explore the development of theory in Alberta archaeology through the lens of work at the site, illustrating our preliminary thoughts and highlighting Barney's contributions. Our larger project treats other major influential figures in the development of Alberta archaeology. Again, our approach is an Edic history of archaeology perspective that is explicitly intended to consider the work that was done within its historical context and avoiding precedentist valuations. We'd be interested in your feedback after the session. Many of you have emic perspectives of the very people we're talking about, both on our interpretation of Barney's contributions and for others who passed through Head Smashed In, who made contributions to the archaeology of our province. Now, according to Barney Reeves, he fell into archaeology backwards. His first experiences of archaeology were with his grandmother, a pot hunter, who Margaret's already mentioned, who had a collection of projectile points. She took him to Head Smashed In when he was 5, and where they did what many people at the time did, they gathered projectile points on the surface of the site, filling bags with them and taking them home. Barney remembered the cattle grazing on the buffalo bone that littered the site. At the time, he had no idea that Head Smashed In would play such an important role in his life. Barney's return to Head Smashed In was in 1965, and his work there would become part of his formal graduate work at the University of Calgary under Richard Forbes. Forbes's first appointment in Alberta was to the Glenbow Foundation in 1954, but by 1955 he'd become the first archaeologist hired by the University of Calgary. As far as we know, this became the first program in Canada dedicated solely to archaeology, as opposed to being housed within anthropology or another cognate discipline like classics or history. In 1966, the University of Calgary initiated the graduate program, even though there was no undergraduate major in archaeology per se. Now, this was driven by Richard McGeough, an American who had joined the National Museum of Canada as an archaeologist in 1949. He spent much of his appointment visiting sites throughout Canada and encouraging the development of regional archaeology. In fact, he spent so much time outside of Ottawa that Tommy Douglas asked about this in Parliament, and Barney believed that he's the only archaeologist to have been mentioned by name in Parliament. In any case, the position in Ottawa became untenable, and he was picked up by the University of Calgary. Now, not a fan of American anthropology or the American theory of the era, despite his training at the University of Chicago, McGeough wanted to develop a British-style program centered upon geology and artifact typology, with the less anthropological theory, the better. Now, despite his own career goals of eventually becoming a theoretician, he wanted a program centered on laboratory analysis and excavation. This orientation steered the Calgary program for the first decades of its existence, but McGeough wouldn't be part of that. Barney recalls that McGeough couldn't get along with the university bureaucracy, and they used the fact that a graduate program had been started without a cognate undergraduate program as an excuse to have him removed. Now, Barney played an important role as one of the prominent early graduate students in the department. His thesis was of such importance to Alberta archaeology that Jack Brink formally published it in the occasional paper series 13 years after it was submitted, saying, "Over the past decade, Brian Reeves' PhD dissertation has been one of the most frequently cited documents by archaeologists working in the Northwestern Plains. Most of us possess worn Xerox copies of someone else's Xerox copy, and before we move into a third generation of duplications, it seems advisable to put this important manuscript into print. To delay any longer would run the risk of the document itself entering the archaeological record." Now, Barney's thesis committee consisted of some of the towering figures of world archaeology who were connected to the University of Calgary, figures like Jane Kelly, as well as Forbes and McGeough. The combination of McGeough and Forbes, we think, was particularly influential. For what Barney achieved at Head Smashed In seems like a marriage of the theoretical and methodological approaches of those two scholars. Barney says that it was Forbes who sent him back to Head Smashed In, the site of his childhood pot hunting. Those experiences led Barney to identify where he should dig first. The pot hunters knew where to find the good stuff, he said, so he followed their lead. He decided to dig where they had been digging, in undisturbed sections at the base of the cliff. Now, one of the big mysteries that Barney set out to address was that no one knew how deep the bone beds were at any of the bison drive sites. And so concomitantly, no one knew how long any of them had been in use. So he set out to dig down as deep as he could and establish the chronology of Head Smashed In. And here is where we think McGeough's methodological influence must have been felt. Before coming to Calgary, McGeough had pioneered excavation techniques in Mexican caves that must have inspired Barney's work. McGeough approached the long time depth of these caves by excavating large vertical cuts. He did so by removing strata from different squares, creating multiple vertical sections with layers of overlap, so that he could check to make sure that he had correctly identified a distinct layer. When these vertical sections were combined, the history of the site as presented through its stratigraphy was revealed. The particular approach of not excavating by horizontal artificial levels was novel, and McGeough referred to it as the Lapeyre technique in his book, The Science of Archaeology, naming it after the cave in which he was working. Now, Barney's work at Head Smashed In was an innovation of this technique, treating the base of the cliff as one would treat a cave site where the accumulation of prehistoric remains over centuries relate to cultural activities and geological features, which seems obvious to us now, but at the time was absolutely brilliant. For Barney applied McGeough's methods to Head Smashed In, where the vertical accumulation preserved the material culture history of Alberta in a fashion that could be translated into typology across the site and applied elsewhere. Now, he was not the first to apply typology to Alberta material culture, but the particular opportunity afforded by head smashing allowed some major breakthroughs. By working by strata, he implemented a level of control in the data that is remarkable given the speed at which he worked. Likewise, his adaptation of McGeough's approach to creating composite stratigraphic charts resulted in what has to be one of the most influential images in Alberta archaeology, Barney's drawing of head Smashton's different stratigraphy plotted with diagnostic point types and C14 dates. However, it is perhaps Forbes's theoretical impact that played a more important role in Barney's interpretation of the data. Unlike McGeough, Forbes was deeply interested in the plains, with communal buffalo hunting one of his major areas of interest. Known by many now as the father of Alberta archaeology, many of the major sites that defined Alberta archaeology were projects of his or overseen by him. Forbes was a strong proponent of methods pioneered by Wiley and Phillips, arguing for their culture-historical approach and using their basic evolutionary scheme as a foil for consideration of the development of plains cultures. But he married this with the neo-evolutionary and cultural ecological trends that post-dated them. In many ways, it is hard to disentangle Forbes's and Reeves' theoretical engagement and approaches to historical reconstruction from one another, at least from our perspective, and perhaps others here can speak to that. Certainly one major element of both of their work in framing Alberta archaeology is a concern with economic adaptation to environment. In Barney's thesis, he argued for the correlation between type of economic adaptation, communal bison hunting-gatherers, generalized hunter-gatherers, generalized hunter-gatherer horticulturalists, and environmental variables, presence of bison, presence of ungulate herds, suitability of maize agriculture. This element of Barney's work at Head Smashton well reflects how the other member of a supervisory committee, the former CAA president Jane Kelly, characterized Canadian archaeology in general. She argued that since Canadian archaeology started so much later than archaeology elsewhere, while the processualist movement was in full swing, there was still a need to construct regional chronologies over a very large and sparsely populated country. As Jeremy Cunningham has paraphrased Kelly and Ron Williamson, they identify Canadian archaeology as primarily focused on culture history with some interest in ecological themes. But what Cunningham has argued is that while this was certainly the case, the situation in relationship to processualism was more complex. Arguing in relation to Canadian archaeology in the 1990s, a bit later than what we were discussing here, Cunningham has argued that Canadian archaeology continued to embrace middle-of-the-road perspectives that remained ambivalent about positions offered by the processual, post-processual debate. Canada's most prominent theoretical voices at the time were also actively arguing that pluralism was a better option than the reductive epistemologies and cultural ontologies proposed by both warring camps. Cunningham continues, Canadian archaeology was not a backwater, but it embraced theory pluralism as one of its defining characteristics. Now, the pluralistic but pragmatic approach to archaeological theory that Kelly and Cunningham ascribed to Canadian archaeology well fits the approach to archaeology that Barney brought to Alberta archaeology, at least at Head Smashton. The theoretical logic that emerges in Barney's works on Head Smashton match what Jane Kelly, along with Marcia Hainan, would present in 1988, and what Cunningham argues reflects Canadian archaeology theory more broadly, inference to best explanation. There is minimal engagement with the kinds of social scientific theorizing that was typical of Binfordian processualism. Rather, the interpretive lenses worked from the evidence to find the most reasonable explanation for that evidence in conversation with the ethnographic traditions and contemporary Indigenous knowledge. Now, Margaret Kennedy had mentioned to us the importance of Robert K. Merton in Barney's work. And while Merton's not mentioned in the literature on Head Smashton that Barney wrote, the importance of Merton for Barney's thinking is apparent. He is best known to archaeologists for his contributions to middle-range theory and sociology, which inspired middle-range theory in archaeology. Now, archaeologists have tended to use this inconsistently, but generally as a method for deriving cultural behavior from material cultural remains. For Barney, we think, the important element of Merton's work was his call that the study of societies should not just be description, nor should it be grand overarching theory. Sociological study, he thought, should be rooted in theories tested against empirical evidence. As Mark Rabb and Albert Goodyear argued in 1984, there is little evidence that archaeologists understood the concept of middle-range theory as that was originally conceived by social science theorists. Those theorists advanced the concept not as a substantive theory of any particular phenomenon, but rather as middle-range theorizing. The essential point was to develop a strategy for integrating research problems and data into cumulative bodies of scientific knowledge, in which theories of limited scope, arrayed at different levels of generality, could be subsumed under domains of increasingly general principles. Now, most archaeologists were not using middle-range theory like this, yet Barney seems to have been inspired in just such a fashion. He may have tried to solve the same problems with sociological theoretical systems frameworks articulated by Talcott Parsons that Merton had tried to solve. As Rabb and Goodyear note, Parsons articulated a structuralist, functionalist systems approach to the study of society, but had difficulty demonstrating how to connect the abstract theory with empirical evidence. Merton tried to solve this through middle-range theory, and Reeves clearly grappled with the same issues, but specifically for the question of how to reconstruct the prehistory of the plains in both descriptive and interpretive fashions, with recourse to the evidence and methods used in cultural historical archaeology. Now, this is perhaps the most overtly theoretical element of Barney's work on head smashed in, what we might classify as early systems theory. In his thesis, Barney situates himself firmly within the Parsonian sociological school. He articulated an approach to social reconstruction that conceptualizes a large oversystem consisting of two supersystems, sociocultural and environmental. While we're simplifying here for time, he argued that at least 4 frames of reference should be utilized in a systems approach to prehistory: the interactional patterns between the non-cultural systems of the effective environment, the interactional patterns between the systems of the effective environment and the cultural systems under consideration, the interactional patterns between the cultural subsystems, and the interactional patterns between the cultural system and the social system. Now, he follows this in his thesis by declaring that analysis should be both descriptive and interpretive, just as Merton was calling for. Now, here then is not just mere culture history, as is often mistakenly ascribed to the Alberta archaeology of this era. We would see it as a more functionalist structuralist approach. In Barney's work, the rejection of naive culture history is further expressed in his concerns about simplistic correlations between material culture type and linguistic family, referencing of Caldwellian-style interaction spheres, and adaptations of Wiley and Phillips' basic method of phase, horizon, and tradition to this Parsonian sociological system. These approaches, while still reflecting a pragmatic inference to best explanation approach, well reflect Merton's call for the study of societies to lie somewhere between description and grand theory, to be rooted in direct engagement with the evidence. Now, this is the other route that archaeological theory was traveling alongside of the processualist movement, better associated with other systems thinkers like Kent Flannery and David Clark, also emergent from structuralist functionalist approaches. And perhaps Alberta archaeology, and archaeologists like Barney, would be more acknowledged as contributing to this theoretical trajectory in world archaeology had there been more interest in writing about the theory. But what drove this work was the need to build chronologies and do the fundamental work of Alberta archaeology, and the theory was just the means to do so, the tool, not the end. From a history of theory perspective, these theoretical trends are apparent in Barney's writing about head smashed in. There is no hint that the generation of this theory was the point of the work. It is clearly just a tool being applied instrumentally to describe and interpret different phases of Plains life. Now, it's hard to quantify just how significant this approach was to Alberta archaeology, again because it is used so instrumentally by these foundational figures. Yet it continues to guide questions and reporting in Alberta archaeology. Engaging with the more than 40,000 archaeological sites recorded in the province so far, their work was foundational. Interaction between ecological systems and social systems, especially economic or technological ones, remains a primary orienting principle, even for those who argue against such readings. Now, we want to end with another theoretical element of Barney's work at head smashed in that we think prefigures later trends. We've argued elsewhere that Jack Brink and Bob Dawes' work at head smashed in the 1980s reflects an approach that we would now call Indigenous archaeology. That work was possible was in good part due to Barney's concerns for consultation and application of emic perspectives to his analysis. In his thesis, for example, Barney argues that the Kootenai word Tanaxa should be used to denote a Plains cultural tradition lasting from the middle to late prehistoric period, including point traditions, that he wasn't taking as equating to culture, of McKean, Hannah, and Pelican Lake. Likewise, the Blackfoot word Napiquan was suggested for the period usually covered by Besant and Old Woman's. Now, our point here is not to argue for or against this nomenclature. The point is to note the urge to apply emic terminology that did not allow for a simple equation of points equaling people. As Barney comments at the end of his influential Scientific American article on head smashed in, for all the deceptively simple material culture, these earliest plainsmen were at the same time excellent organizers and daring coordinators when many of the white man's ancestors were still simple hunters and gatherers in the chill forests of Mesolithic Europe. Now, those words from 1983, not in language that we would want to use today, but what they point to is part of the larger project that head smashed in that came to be better defined by Jack Brink, using archaeology to combat racism in Alberta. In particular, Jack articulated an argument very much influenced by Barney's that head smashed in reflected complex, economically sophisticated behavior. Here, the consideration of the interaction of the oversystem devised by Barney of the sociocultural and environmental spheres is operationalized as an interpretive system where those interactions are presented as achievements worth celebrating. And the culmination of that end product has been the head smashed in interpretive center. Now, much more could be said of Barney Reeves' theoretical contributions to head smashed in Alberta archaeology. But we will leave that for our book, and we hope that members of this audience can clarify or correct any misinterpretations we have made. Thank you very much.